So just really quickly, so this is session 2 of the 3-part workshop series that we're doing. Just to reinforce program objectives is to really get clear on what is a way forward towards regional resilience through a clear view of opportunity, risk, and then what do we focus on in that context. Today, I'll just do a really short, sharp refresh, and the reason for the refresh is not so much to repeat, although there is a little bit of a repeat of what we've already been through, but it's the pace of change is still moving quite quickly. So it's really to anchor people into what else are we seeing now that might be different even just in the couple of weeks since we last met. Then we'll spend some time working on conditions. And again, it doesn't really matter how much time you've had to do some thinking around this prior to now. We'll do some work on that together. Then I want to spend a bit of time talking about values. And that's a really important piece of taking a strategic approach, we think, in fast-moving disruptive change is always being able to anchor back to what are the core values that we have as an organization or as a community, so that we're making decisions that are guided by our values. And then we'll get into how do you start really thinking about opportunity risk so that the work we can do between this session and the next one is to, out of conditions and an emerging understanding of values, really start to dig into what are we seeing as the opportunities and risks we might choose to focus on, and what value might we generate by focusing in that way. And then our final session in another 3 weeks' time, we'll look at, okay, so with a clearer view of conditions, opportunity, risk, and value, what does it mean from a capability perspective? And then from there, hopefully, it becomes a bit more clear around how do we get strategy into action, understanding that what becomes, we find really powerful is once you do this baseline thinking, if you keep that view up to date, then all you have to do is do thinking that adds to that, right? You don't have to go back and recreate your view of the world. You just keep a fresh view and you can move much more quickly as the pace of change is likely to demand. Does that make sense to everyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool. All right, so just really quickly in terms of a refresh, I just wanted to reinforce that this is all about understanding disruption and then using that as a force for change, right? It's a conscious choice about, are we going to let disruption continue to be a headwind, or do we flip it around and turn it into a bit more of a tailwind in an organizational context, in a community context, even at an individual level? We've talked a lot about the rise of the COVID economy. For those who missed the bit that we were sort of ruminating on at the start, what is a bit frustrating is that the narrative that seems to be taking hold across Australia is that we're going to be fine, everything's okay. You know, the lucky country thing, the she'll be right, mate attitude that we have in this place, when the reality is we're part of a global interconnected system and it's not all right in other parts of the world. So sure, can we potentially recover in a different way and open up and have a baseline of social economic activity that maybe works for a bit longer? Of course. The risk there then is that we're not orienting fast enough towards the rapid emergence of the real climate economy.
David, can I just ask, in relation to those horizons, is there a time frame that you have in your mind around?
Yeah, there is actually, and I've got some updated slides that I can share. Okay. What we're saying is that basically this space here, say Horizon 1 to Horizon 3, is now through till about 2025. But 2025 to 2030 is the space where we have to be ready with social, economic, environmental activity that's really tuned to a climate economy. And that's about business models, operating models, product services, etc., that take the impact of climate, or impact on the climate, if you like, or impact on the environment into account. At the moment, as we all know, most of those models, you know, the environmental impact is just an externality, it's ignored. But we're seeing just a massive amount of data now coming through, which says if we don't really properly fix some of these issues or be active around some of these issues by the end of this decade, then what we start to do is bake in things like 4 degrees centigrade as the temperature rise we'll see by the end of the century. And so then what we think that means for organizations and communities is you get faced with a pretty binary choice, right? Which is either what do you do now to more rapidly and radically reorient to a climate economy, or start planning now for having significant disaster mitigation and recovery plans in place, because we will be dealing with the extremes of the climate from 2050 onwards if we don't get it sorted. So we're trying to get people to understand that we just don't have the time to waste another decade before we get into those issues. And what you can do is use what we're learning through COVID to take forward new models, right? So the reason, for example, potentially for maintaining a remote work environment, a hybrid work environment, is not just because it's a way of keeping people COVID safe in organizations. It's actually better for the planet, potentially, if we aren't commuting in the way that we used to do, if we're not traveling around the world for meetings in the way that we used to do. There's a real planetary impulse in that. And again, I'll share this excerpt from Rebecca Costa's presentation last week to us. But one of the things she reinforced is that if you take the whole of biological history of the planet, 99.99999 repeating, of all species that have ever existed on the planet are now extinct. We're the only species that we know of that has a consciousness of that and of our relationship with that system. And we've got a conscious choice to make, which is, are we setting ourselves up for extinction at some point in the future, or will we properly reorient? Because the planet doesn't care, right? We just 99.99999 repeating, we just become another bit of that if we don't consciously choose to organize in a way that takes the planet and the environment and climate impacts into account. Does that make sense? And we're not alone in saying this. Rebecca is very clear in her message. She has a very strong belief that we have access to all of the data and all of the science and technology that we need to sort this stuff out if we choose to apply it. If you haven't seen David Attenborough's recently released documentary, that's well worth watching. He paints a fairly stark picture as well, but then again offers his version of some solutions. But it all comes back to, what do we choose to do? And what we're saying is you can actively make those choices now, right? So what you do in the next 3 to 4 years in this space is about a bridge into this space, building the capability now to be in that space, and understanding if you do that now, you're very likely to be ahead of the game, and there's real opportunity to secure sustainable value generation, whether that's as a business model or a community operating model, whatever it might be. Yeah, makes sense? Mm-hmm. So that just is a reinforcement for us that what we're trying to push is that change ahead of change mentality, that a resilient future is very much about that, and that it is those choices we make in this period that will help put us on that trajectory. If you think about that graph of how systems maintain or not resilience in the face of disruptive change. So it's that choice that we make now that puts us on that pathway. The alternative, of course, is we just keep boiling ourselves to death, which is not the preferred future that I see for my kids and their kids. And then it's about resetting so that we're really thinking about how do we leverage disruption. It's a mindset thing first and foremost. We're using strategy and action to get that done. And that is about being in continuous strategic thinking and action. Gone are the days of taking a long time to do a strategic plan and then thinking you have time to do implementation. There might be some rigorous thinking that takes some time to get it all kicked off. But as I said at the start, once you're into action and you've got that continuous view of conditions, it's much easier to keep pace with the pace of change. I was in a session yesterday with a local council that we're working with in the metropolitan region, and their internal staff were presenting to the executive leadership team, here's our view of what we're starting to see as possible in terms of our kind of priority areas of strategic focus. And as they're presenting it, the CEO says, I wish we hadn't done all that work on what's our vision for the community 2 years ago, because this has actually shaped a much clearer vision for where we could be headed. Because we started with conditions and got really clear on opportunity, risk, and what are we trying to do in terms of value generation. That orients you towards a vision for the future in a very different way to the traditional kind of visioning processes do. So it's about just being in that mindset all the time and aiming for change ahead of change. So with that is just a bit of an opening context. I'll pause there for any kind of further comments, questions, reflections before we dive into a bit more around conditions analysis.
I think, David, I love it. It's Elena here. I love it. But I think just with the whole climate debate, people find it really hard to hear this.
Yeah.
And there's a few people have been doing work recently. I've noticed some articles and books about how you can raise the conversation without just terrifying people. Yeah. And I think with particularly in the Northeast at the moment, we have a population that's just fatigued. Mm. And therefore that makes them even less likely to be able to hear a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
That's how we raise it. I don't know. What are other people's thoughts?
Well, one of the things that occurs to me is when you're planning ahead and things keep changing all the time, is part of, our plan that you're suggesting to keep evaluating and saying, is this still relevant? Is this still the way I should be going?
Yeah. I think it's about saying, is this still relevant? But having, dare I say it, a fairly clear vision that what we should be orienting towards is, what does this look like in an economy, a social economy that is tuned much more so to the, if you like, the health of the planet, but for people on the planet. And there are some examples starting to emerge. I don't know if you've seen that British Petroleum has just come out publicly and said, we are not going to be an oil and gas company for very much longer. We're going to be an energy company, and we will be on the path to renewables. We will be net zero carbon, I think they've said, by 2050, and will be totally reoriented to renewable energy by 2030. Now, that has been difficult for them because the share price has dived, people are up in arms, blah, blah, blah. And the CEO is saying, we don't have a choice. We have to do this. This is not about return to shareholders and the stock market. This is about the future of the planet and people on the planet. So this is what we are. Becomes our guiding light. Now, the reality of that is it's much easier to do that if you've got policy settings which incentivize that, and we know that we don't. Biden gets elected. If that happens, then we probably will much more quickly. If he doesn't, we've got 4 more years of chaos around that particular question. But it doesn't mean we can't, at an individual level and then at a regional level, be having those conversations to say, what do we do? Particularly in Australia, where, 8 months ago, 12 months ago, it was like the bushfires were the thing, right? Before we hit COVID, it was a deeper and a visceral understanding of the real climate impacts. And now that, the west coast of the US is still on fire, and it doesn't even make, might be on page 6 of the news. The other thing I'd say really quickly, and then I want to shut up and hear what other people have to say. ABC this week released, there was a short article about some research that's been done recently. And in amongst all this chaos and in amongst the exhaustion that people are facing through COVID, climate is increasing on the agenda. It's really, the people's understanding of how important that is continuing to go up. So I think in Australia, the time is right to be much more ambitious with our, as I say, local and regional agendas about how do we put that front and center. Other thoughts, comments, questions?
I have found sometimes when you're talking about those challenging issues, just put my little video on, there we go, is to talk about the actions of it rather than the cause in some ways. So say, like, I've got a colleague who very much doesn't believe in climate change, and political lenses, we are far opposite, but we have the same vision for the region and we have the same environmental values. And so if we talk on that plane and we talk about the actions that you can do to reduce your impact on the environment that we both love, then we find common ground. And I found that really an interesting process, sort of exploring that with her.
Yeah. there's a reason why we're going to spend some time on values today, and that's exactly right. Like, you can find common ground through shared values. Other thoughts? Sorry, I'm scribbling some notes here.
I guess